In the summer of 2022, a team of geneticists working in the Naples Archaeological Museum made a discovery that should have made international headlines. It should have rewritten history textbooks. Instead, within 6 weeks, the lead researcher was quietly removed from the project. The preliminary findings were buried in an obscure Italian academic journal that almost nobody reads, and the international press never mentioned it at all. What did they find? The DNA extracted from 73 victims of the Pompeii catastrophe contained genetic markers that, according to every established timeline, should not exist in 79 AD. We are talking about mitochondrial DNA sequences that match populations from geographical regions that had supposedly never made contact with southern Italy during the Roman period. We are talking about haplogroups that appear in the genetic record thousands of years before they should be present in the Mediterranean. We are talking about statistical anomalies, so significant that the probability of them occurring naturally sits at less than 0.001%. The scientist who initially flagged these impossibilities was Dr. Gabriella Notizia, a molecular archaeologist with over 20 years of experience in ancient DNA extraction. She had worked on remains from Ötzi the Iceman, from Egyptian mummies, from Neolithic burial sites across Europe. She knew what normal ancient DNA looked like. She knew what contamination looked like. And she knew that what she was seeing in the Pompeii samples was neither normal nor contamination. In her preliminary notes that were later requested to be deleted from the project files, Dr. Notizia wrote something remarkable. She wrote that the genetic diversity present in the Pompeii population was, quote, inconsistent with a stable urban population of the purported time period, and showed markers suggesting either significant time displacement or survival lineages from a previous advanced population cycle, unquote. Those are careful scientific words for something that sounds impossible. Time displacement, previous advanced population cycle. These are not phrases that appear in mainstream archaeology journals. But here is where it gets even stranger. When Dr. Notizia requested permission to conduct carbon-14 redating on the bone samples themselves, separate from the volcanic context, her request was denied. When she pushed harder, asking why they would not want to verify the absolute dates of the human remains independent of the eruption date, she was told the funding had been reallocated. 3 weeks later, she was no longer listed as part of the research team. Her name disappeared from the project website. Her university email stopped responding. And when independent researchers tried to contact her in late 2022, they found she had taken a sudden sabbatical to an undisclosed location. The genetic data that caused all this trouble remains partially published, but only if you know where to look. Buried in a supplementary data file of a paper titled Population Genetics of Campanian Urban Centers in the 1st Century AD are tables showing the haplogroup distributions. And if you actually read those tables, if you cross-reference them with modern genetic databases, you start to see the problems. 7 of the 73 samples showed mitochondrial haplogroup U5A1, a marker associated with hunter-gatherer populations from Northern Europe, populations that should not be present in significant numbers in a Roman city in 79 AD. 4 samples showed haplogroup X2, which is exceptionally rare in Europe and primarily found in specific Native American populations and isolated pockets of the Middle East. The presence of X2 in Roman Pompeii is statistically absurd. It is like finding a smartphone in a medieval castle. It does not fit the accepted historical model, but the real bombshell sits in the Y chromosome data from the male victims. 12 of 41 male samples carried haplogroup R1BU106, which is strongly associated with Bronze Age migrations that supposedly ended 2,000 years before Pompeii's destruction. The frequency of this marker in the Pompeii sample is 3 times higher than it appears in modern southern Italian populations, and 7 times higher than it should appear in a Roman-era urban center, based on every genetic model we have. What does this mean? There are only a few possible explanations, and none of them fit the comfortable narrative we have been taught. Either Pompeii's population included people from geographical regions and time periods that contradict our entire understanding of Roman demographics, or the city itself is older than we have been told and was inhabited by survivors of an earlier civilization that possessed significant maritime and travel capabilities, or the dating of the eruption itself is wrong. That third option is the one that apparently terrified someone enough to bury this research. Because if the eruption did not happen in 79 AD, if it happened earlier or later by even a few hundred years, then our entire synchronized timeline of Roman history starts to fall apart. Every date, every emperor, every war, every historical event we have tied to other events through cross-referencing suddenly becomes questionable. And there is more. 6 of the samples contain DNA degradation patterns inconsistent with volcanic preservation. Normal ancient DNA from catastrophic burial shows specific damage patterns from heat, ash, and rapid mineralization. But these 6 samples showed damage more consistent with long-term groundwater exposure and freeze-thaw cycles. In other words, they looked like they had been dead and buried for much longer than 1943 years. They looked older, significantly older. When independent geneticist Dr. Michael Hofreiter from the University of Potsdam reviewed the published data at the request of a documentary team in 2023, he stated on record that the genetic diversity metrics were, quote, highly unusual and warrant further investigation, including absolute dating methods independent of volcanic stratigraphy, unquote. That documentary never aired. The production company cited technical difficulties and budget constraints. Dr. Hofreiter declined to comment further when contacted by other researchers. So we are left with genetic evidence that points to something impossible, a population in Pompeii that includes lineages from the wrong places and possibly the wrong time periods. Data that suggests either our dating methods are flawed, our understanding of ancient population movements is completely wrong, or something more disturbing. That Pompeii was not a typical Roman city at all, but perhaps one of the last remaining centers of a much older civilization whose genetic legacy we have misattributed to the Romans. Think about that for a moment. What if the Romans did not build Pompeii? What if they inherited it? What if they moved into a city that was already ancient, already sophisticated, already filled with technologies and knowledge they did not fully understand? And what if the genetic evidence proves that the original inhabitants, the real builders, were still there when Vesuvius erupted, living alongside the Romans who thought they were the civilization? The genetic markers do not lie. DNA is the most honest historical record we have. It cannot be edited by emperors or rewritten by victors. And the DNA from Pompeii is screaming that something about our accepted history is fundamentally wrong. If you are finding this evidence as compelling as we are, and you want to keep exploring the mysteries that mainstream archaeology refuses to address, consider subscribing to Tales Before Tesla and hitting that notification bell. We are here to ask the questions that make people uncomfortable and follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it contradicts everything we thought we knew. Now, back to what they found buried with those impossible DNA samples. Because the genetic anomalies were just the beginning. When researchers cross-referenced the individuals carrying these impossible markers with their burial locations and associated artifacts, they discovered something even more disturbing. The people with the most anomalous DNA were not buried in the common areas. They were not found in the typical residential streets where most victims were discovered. They were concentrated in specific structures, buildings that had been labeled as temples or public buildings, but showed architectural features that did not match any other Roman construction. These structures, 3 of them in total, contained 21 of the most genetically anomalous individuals, and all 3 buildings showed evidence of catastrophic destruction that predated the 79 AD eruption by a significant margin. The foundation stones showed heat damage and volcanic glass deposits that, when tested, dated to approximately 12,800 years ago, to the Younger Dryas impact event that devastated civilizations worldwide. Someone built sophisticated stone structures in Pompeii over 12,000 years ago. Those structures were destroyed in a cataclysm, and then, thousands of years later, Romans built on top of the ruins without apparently understanding what they were building upon. And when Vesuvius erupted again in 79 AD, the people who died in those ancient structures carried DNA that suggests they knew something, that they were different, that they were perhaps the last descendants of whoever built those foundations in the first place. This is why Dr. Notizia wanted carbon-14 dating done on the bones themselves. Because radiocarbon dating of organic material is independent of volcanic context. It would tell us absolutely when these people died, regardless of what we think we know about when Vesuvius erupted. And if those dates came back showing that some of the victims were older than 79 AD, or younger, or scattered across different time periods, it would prove that either our volcanic dating methods are catastrophically flawed or that Pompeii experienced multiple destructions that we have conflated into a single event. But we will never know, because that test was never allowed to happen. The bones remain locked in storage, and the genetic data remains partially published and almost entirely ignored by mainstream archaeology. The evidence sits there, available to anyone who wants to look, but nobody with institutional authority wants to look. Because looking means questioning, and questioning means the entire carefully constructed timeline of Western civilization might need to be rebuilt from scratch. The people of Pompeii, at least some of them, were not who we think they were. Their DNA proves it, and someone, somewhere, decided that truth was too dangerous to become common knowledge. The official story of Pompeii is clean and simple. Mount Vesuvius erupted on August 24th in the year 79 AD. The Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum were buried under ash and pumice. Approximately 2,000 people died. The cities were forgotten for over 1,500 years until excavations began in the 1700s. Clean, simple, completely provable through historical records, volcanic deposits, and archaeological stratigraphy. Except when you actually dig into the ground at Pompeii, when you look at the layers beneath the famous 79 AD destruction level, the story becomes significantly more complicated and significantly more disturbing. In 1962, Italian archaeologist Amedeo Maiuri was supervising deep excavations beneath the Forum of Pompeii when his team uncovered something that should not exist. Below the Roman city, below the streets and buildings everyone knows, they found another city. Not a primitive settlement, not a simple village, a sophisticated urban center with paved roads, engineered drainage systems, and stone architecture that showed catastrophic destruction from volcanic activity. This lower city was buried under 15 feet of volcanic debris before the Romans ever arrived. Maiuri documented these findings meticulously. He published papers describing at least 3 distinct destruction layers visible in the deep excavations, each separated by evidence of rebuilding and rehabilitation. 3 separate catastrophes. 3 separate cities built on top of each other. The 79 AD eruption was not the first time Vesuvius destroyed Pompeii. It was at minimum the 4th. These findings were acknowledged briefly in Italian archaeological literature in the 1960s and 70s, then quietly stopped being mentioned. Modern guidebooks do not talk about the cities beneath the city. Tour guides do not take visitors to see the deep excavations. And when archaeologists are asked directly about the multiple destruction layers, they tend to give vague answers about earlier settlements and change the subject quickly. Why? Because the deeper you go, the older the destruction layers get, and the more sophisticated the architecture becomes. That is backwards. That is not how civilization is supposed to work. We are supposed to see primitive foundations at the bottom and increasingly advanced construction as we move up through time. But at Pompeii, the deepest levels show engineering capabilities that match or exceed the Roman layer at the top. The lowest destruction layer that has been properly documented and dated sits at 23 feet below the 79 AD surface. The volcanic material in this layer has been tested and shows chemical signatures consistent with a massive Vesuvius eruption occurring approximately 3,700 years ago, around 1700 BC. This matches historically with the Bronze Age collapse, a period when civilizations across the entire Mediterranean mysteriously disintegrated within a span of 50 years. But here is what makes this deeply unsettling. The structures buried in that 1700 BC layer include water pipes made from sophisticated ceramic composites, foundation stones cut with precision that suggest diamond-tipped tools or advanced abrasives, and concrete that contains volcanic pozzolan ash mixed in specific ratios that improve water resistance. These are not primitive Bronze Age technologies. These are engineering solutions that supposedly were not developed until Roman times 2,000 years later. So, either the Romans invented these technologies independently and just happened to build their city on top of ruins where previous people had invented identical technologies, or the Romans did not invent these things at all. They inherited them, They found sophisticated infrastructure buried under volcanic ash. They dug it up, they studied it, they copied it, and they rebuilt on top of it without crediting or perhaps even understanding the original builders. This pattern appears throughout Pompeii when you know where to look. The famous Roman baths, the ones tourists photograph, are built directly on top of earlier bath complexes that show identical layouts and plumbing systems. The Villa of the Mysteries, one of the most well-preserved structures, has foundation walls that predate the Roman period frescoes by at least 800 years based on construction techniques and mortar composition. The building existed long before the Romans painted it. Even more compelling is the evidence from ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2008 by a team from the University of Naples. These surveys were looking for voids and buried structures to help plan conservation efforts. What they found instead were massive geometric anomalies in the deep substrata, regular patterns of stone and empty space that suggest large-scale construction buried far below the excavated levels. Some of these anomalies sit at depths of 40 to 50 feet, which would place them in time periods when, according to mainstream archaeology, this region should have been populated by simple agricultural communities living in wooden huts. The radar data showed what appeared to be a grid system, orthogonal streets arranged in precise right angles, extending beneath the entire modern excavation site. This is urban planning. This is civilization-level organization, and it is buried under multiple layers of volcanic destruction that predate Rome by thousands of years. The university initially planned to conduct exploratory excavations to investigate these deep anomalies. Funding was allocated, teams were assembled. Then, in 2009, the project was quietly canceled. No official explanation was given. The radar data was archived, and subsequent researchers who have requested access to that data for independent analysis have been told the files are unavailable due to ongoing preservation concerns. We can see this pattern repeating at Herculaneum as well, Pompeii's sister city buried by the same eruption. When excavators dug down to the ancient beach level, where hundreds of people died trying to escape by boat, they found something unexpected beneath the skeletons. Stone docks. Massive engineered harbor works, built from blocks weighing multiple tons each, fitted together with precision joinery that requires no mortar. And these harbor structures were already ancient, already partially ruined and covered in marine growth, when the 79 AD victims died on top of them. Roman Herculaneum was built over the ruins of a sophisticated port city that had already been destroyed by volcanic activity centuries or millennia earlier. The Romans were living in the ruins of giants, quite literally building their homes inside and on top of massive stone structures they found already in place. Now, here is where the timeline really starts to fall apart. Between the 1700 BC destruction layer and the 79 AD layer, there are at least two more catastrophic destruction horizons visible in the deep excavations. One dates to approximately 800 BC, the other to around 400 BC. Each shows evidence of total devastation, volcanic burial, and then eventual rehabilitation and rebuilding. This means Vesuvius has a pattern. It destroys civilizations in this location roughly every 800 to 1000 years. 1700 BC, 800 BC, 400 BC, 79 AD. The math is remarkably consistent, and if the pattern holds, we are currently about 1945 years into a cycle that historically runs about 900 years. But mainstream archaeology presents Pompeii as if the 79 AD eruption was a singular, unprecedented event, as if Vesuvius had been peacefully dormant for all of human history and suddenly decided to explode during the Roman Empire. This is provably false. The ground itself proves it false. Every deep excavation proves it false. So why do we maintain this fiction? Why do textbooks still present Pompeii as a Roman city destroyed in a freak natural disaster rather than the latest iteration of a location that has been repeatedly built, destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again across at least 4,000 years? Perhaps because acknowledging the cyclical destructions means acknowledging that civilization in the Mediterranean is not a steady upward march from primitive to advanced. It is a cycle. Societies rise, develop sophisticated technologies and urban infrastructure, and then get completely annihilated by volcanic or climatic catastrophes. The survivors lose most of their knowledge. Their descendants rebuild from partial understanding. Eventually, they reach a similar level of sophistication, and then the mountain erupts again. If this is true, if this is the actual pattern of human civilization in volcanically active regions, then it means we are not special. We are not the pinnacle. We are just the current iteration. And our cities, our technologies, our entire civilization sits on top of the ruins of people who reached similar heights and were erased. The volcanic glass deposits found between the destruction layers tell another part of this story. Obsidian fragments and pumice showing heat signatures consistent with temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius appear in layers dating back 12,800 years. This matches precisely with the Younger Dryas impact event, a global catastrophe that caused sudden climate shifts, mass extinctions, and the collapse of civilizations worldwide. Evidence for this impact event appears in ice cores, in sediment layers, in geological formations on every continent, and it appears in the deepest excavated levels at Pompeii, meaning this location has been catastrophically destroyed by cosmic or volcanic events multiple times across the entire span of human civilization. And each time, someone came back and rebuilt. The people who built the deepest structures had knowledge of volcanology, understood the risks, and built anyway. They developed concrete formulas specifically designed to resist volcanic heat. They created water systems that could survive ash burial and be excavated and reused. They were preparing for the mountain to erupt again because they knew it had erupted before. This was inherited knowledge. This was civilizational memory. And then the mountain erupted again, as it always does, and the knowledge was lost, and new people came and found the ruins and thought they were building something new, but they were not. They were just rebuilding what had been built before. The Romans did not create Pompeii. They inherited it, misunderstood it, and then lost it again when the cycle repeated. The timeline we have been taught is a comfortable simplification. The reality visible in the ground is far more complex and far more unsettling. Pompeii is not a city. It is a location cursed or blessed, depending on your perspective, to repeatedly host human civilization and then destroy it. And we are simply the latest people to have forgotten this pattern. Before we go further into what else they have been hiding, I am curious about something. Where in the world are you listening to this right now? What time is it where you are? Are you winding down for the night, or maybe starting your morning commute? Drop a comment and let me know your city and your local time. It is fascinating to think about all of us, scattered across different time zones, all diving into these same suppressed historical patterns together. There is something poetic about people in Tokyo at dawn and people in California at midnight simultaneously discovering that our entire understanding of civilization might be backwards. The mountain remembers. The stones remember. And the layers buried beneath our feet are screaming that everything we think we know about how long civilization has existed and how advanced our ancestors truly were needs to be completely reconsidered. Stand in the ruins of Pompeii today and look at the streets. Really look at them. Those are not cobblestones laid by hand. Those are precisely engineered road surfaces with crowned profiles for water drainage, fitted stone curbs, raised pedestrian crossings at exact intervals, and embedded reflective stones that would catch torchlight at night to guide travelers. This is infrastructure designed by people who understood traffic flow, hydrology, and urban planning at a level that most modern cities did not achieve until the 1900s. The Romans supposedly built this, except when materials engineers from MIT analyzed core samples from Pompeii's roads in 2017, they found something that should not be possible with Roman-era technology. The stone surfaces had been treated with a silicon-based sealant that penetrates 3 to 4 millimeters into the rock matrix, creating a water-resistant layer that prevents freeze-thaw damage and significantly extends the lifespan of the pavement. This is nanotechnology. This requires an understanding of molecular bonding and chemical penetration that was not officially developed until the late 20th century. The research team, led by Dr. Linda Seymour, published their findings in the Journal of Materials Science but framed them carefully. They called it a naturally occurring phenomenon possibly enhanced by volcanic minerals. But in her personal notes that were leaked by a graduate student in 2019, Dr. Seymour wrote something different. She wrote that the silicon penetration patterns were inconsistent with natural formation and showed evidence of deliberate application using methods we cannot currently replicate. Walk into any of the surviving buildings and examine the walls. The frescoes get all the attention, those stunning paintings of myths and gardens and daily life. But look past the paint at what the paint is applied to. The plaster underneath is not simple lime plaster. It is a multi-layer composite system with different aggregate materials in each layer, designed to control moisture migration and prevent salt crystallization that would cause the decorative surface to fail. The outermost layer contains crushed marble in a specific grain size distribution that creates a luminous quality when painted. This is materials engineering. This is understanding the physics of light reflection and the chemistry of surface preparation. Roman architect Vitruvius wrote about plaster techniques, sure, but his descriptions do not match what actually exists on the walls of Pompeii. His instructions would produce serviceable plaster. What we see in Pompeii is optimized, refined across hundreds of experiments or inherited from someone who had already done those experiments. The consistency of the technique across hundreds of buildings suggests standardization, suggests an educational system or guild knowledge that goes far deeper than Vitruvius ever described. Then there is the concrete. Roman concrete is famous, celebrated as one of their great innovations. The Pantheon in Rome, still standing 2,000 years later, proves they understood something profound about building materials. But Pompeii's concrete is different. Analysis by engineers at the University of California, Berkeley in 2013 showed that the concrete in Pompeii's harbor structures and foundations contains volcanic ash from Vesuvius mixed with lime in ratios that create a pozzolanic reaction when exposed to seawater. This reaction actually makes the concrete stronger over time as seawater penetrates it and causes additional crystallization. This is brilliant. This is understanding chemistry at a level that seems impossible for people who did not have microscopes, who did not have laboratories, who supposedly mixed concrete by trial and error. The specific ratios matter enormously. Too much volcanic ash and the concrete never sets properly. Too little and you do not get the pozzolanic reaction. The Pompeii formulas are optimized to within 5% of ideal composition. That kind of precision does not come from trial and error. That comes from either extensive experimental documentation or inherited knowledge from previous builders who had already solved the problem. And here is what makes it truly strange. The concrete formulas vary by application. Harbor structures use one formula. Building foundations use another. Water cisterns use a third formula specifically designed to resist chemical erosion from stored water. Each formula is optimized for its specific use case. This is not one clever discovery. This is a comprehensive materials science program that understood different environmental stresses and created tailored solutions for each. The Roman Empire existed for roughly 500 years in this region before Pompeii was destroyed. That is theoretically enough time to develop these technologies through incremental improvement. Except we do not see incremental improvement in the archaeological record. We see these sophisticated techniques appearing essentially fully formed in early Roman construction, as if they were adapted from existing knowledge rather than developed from scratch. Now examine the water system. Pompeii had running water delivered by aqueduct from sources over 20 miles away. The aqueduct system itself is well documented and fits Roman engineering capabilities. But the distribution system inside the city is something else entirely. Every major intersection had a castellum, a distribution tower that split the incoming water flow into multiple channels serving different neighborhoods. These towers used bronze valve systems to regulate pressure and flow. Pressure regulation. Think about what that means. It means understanding that water pressure increases with elevation drop. It means calculating flow rates through pipes of different diameters. It means designing valve systems that can handle sustained pressure without failing. Modern municipal water systems were not designed with this level of sophistication until engineers developed fluid dynamics mathematics in the 1700s. Yet, Pompeii's system, supposedly designed by people who used Roman numerals and had no concept of calculus, demonstrates practical understanding of hydraulic principles that should not exist. Dr. James Wright, a hydraulic engineer who studied Pompeii's water system for a documentary in 2015, stated on camera that the valve designs showed clear understanding of Bernoulli's principle and pressure compensation. and that attempting to reverse engineer the system using only tools and mathematical knowledge available in the 1st century AD was not feasible within any reasonable development time frame. The documentary never aired. Production was halted mid-filming for reasons that were never made public. Look at the metalwork. The famous bronze statues, the decorative fixtures, the functional hardware like hinges and locks. Bronze is a copper-tin alloy that seems simple enough. Melt copper and tin together, cast your object, done. Except metallurgical analysis of Pompeii's bronze objects shows alloy compositions that vary by intended use. Structural bronze has higher tin content for hardness. Decorative bronze has lower tin content for workability. Marine bronze, used for harbor fixtures and boat fittings, includes small amounts of lead to improve corrosion resistance. This is alloy optimization. This requires systematic testing, documentation, and knowledge transfer. You cannot discover these specific formulas by accident. Someone conducted extensive experiments, probably across generations, testing different compositions, and documenting which worked best for which applications. The institutional knowledge required to maintain this level of metallurgical sophistication across a large city is substantial. And then there are the pigments in those famous frescoes, the reds and blues and golds that still glow with color after 2,000 years underground. Chemical analysis has identified pigments including Egyptian blue, cinnabar, red lead, and gold leaf applied using techniques that require precise temperature control and chemical knowledge. Egyptian blue, for instance, is a synthetic pigment created by heating silica, copper, calcium, and alkali to exactly 800 to 900 degrees Celsius. Too hot and the crystals do not form properly. Too cool and you get a different compound entirely. Creating Egyptian blue is chemistry. It requires temperature measurement, precise component ratios, and controlled firing conditions. Pompeii's artists used this pigment extensively, which means Pompeii had either direct trade connections with Egyptian chemical manufactories or local workshops that could replicate the production process. Either way, it demonstrates a level of technical knowledge exchange and industrial capability that seems remarkable for the ancient world. Cinnabar, the brilliant red pigment, is mercury sulfide. It is toxic. Workers who processed cinnabar regularly died from mercury poisoning. Yet Pompeii's workshops show evidence of ventilation systems, specialized tools, and separation of toxic work areas from general living spaces. Someone understood the health hazards and designed mitigation systems. Someone had enough workers die to learn what killed them and enough organizational structure to implement safety protocols. This is industrial civilization. This is regulatory oversight. This is institutional knowledge built across generations of craft specialists who documented their techniques, taught apprentices, and operated within a larger economic system that valued and protected specialized knowledge. All of this, according to mainstream history, was developed by the Romans during their empire. But the Romans left written records. They wrote extensively about engineering, about construction, about techniques and methods. And nowhere in those writings do we find adequate explanation for the level of sophistication visible in Pompeii's physical infrastructure. Vitruvius gives us plaster recipes and column proportions. He does not give us pressure-compensating valve designs or optimized concrete formulas or silicon sealant application methods. The gap between what the Romans wrote down and what they actually built is enormous, which suggests one of two possibilities. Either Roman engineers were far more advanced than their writings indicate and deliberately kept their most sophisticated knowledge secret, or they were building from inherited technical manuals and practical knowledge that came from earlier civilizations and they did not fully understand the principles behind what they were copying. The physical evidence at Pompeii demonstrates technological capabilities that should not exist in 79 AD based on the documented development of human knowledge. These capabilities either represent a massive gap in our understanding of Roman science and engineering, or they represent inherited technology from the earlier civilizations buried in those lower destruction layers. Civilizations that had reached similar or greater sophistication before being destroyed and forgotten. The stones, the concrete, the metal, the pigments do not lie. They are physical proof of capabilities that our historical timeline cannot adequately explain. And that is deeply uncomfortable for a field that prides itself on having a clear, linear narrative of human technological progress. Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD and destroyed Pompeii. That much we know. What we rarely discuss is what else was happening on planet Earth during that same narrow window of time. And when you start looking at the global picture, when you map catastrophes across continents during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, a deeply unsettling pattern emerges. In the year 186 AD, just over a century after Pompeii, Lake Taupo in New Zealand produced one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in human history. The explosion was so massive that it ejected 30 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, approximately 30 times more than Vesuvius. Chinese historical records from that exact year describe the sky turning yellow, crops failing across Asia, and severe famines spreading from the coast inland. Roman records from the same period mention prolonged darkness and unusual atmospheric phenomena visible from Britain to Egypt. These were not isolated events. They were connected through the atmosphere, through volcanic winter effects that spanned the globe. Move backward to around the year 160 AD. The Ilopango volcano in El Salvador erupted with such force that it depopulated most of Central America. Mayan cities were abandoned. Agricultural centers that had sustained populations for centuries were buried under meters of ash. The eruption column reached the stratosphere and circulated volcanic aerosols worldwide. Tree ring data from Europe shows dramatic growth suppression starting in 160 AD, indicating reduced sunlight and lower temperatures lasting for years. Now come back to the Mediterranean. Between 60 and 100 AD, geological evidence shows a cluster of submarine volcanic eruptions in the Aegean Sea. These created tsunamis that devastated coastal settlements throughout Greece and Asia Minor. Historical accounts mention sudden flooding, the sea retreating and returning with violence. Entire harbor cities vanished. Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century, describes visiting ruins of cities along the Greek coast that had been overwhelmed by waves within living memory and never rebuilt. And overlaying all of this, wrapping around the entire Mediterranean basin like a noose, is evidence of dramatic seismic activity throughout the 1st century AD. Pompeii itself experienced a major earthquake in 62 AD, 17 years before the fatal eruption. That quake damaged most of the city. Many buildings were still under repair when Vesuvius erupted, but this was not an isolated quake. Historical records document major earthquakes in Rome, in Antioch, in Jerusalem, in Alexandria, all within a 50-year window. The Earth's crust throughout the Mediterranean was destabilizing simultaneously. Multiple volcanic systems were activating. Seismic networks were lighting up across thousands of miles. This was not random. This was a synchronized geophysical event affecting an entire tectonic region. But the pattern extends beyond just volcanoes and earthquakes. Ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica shows a sharp spike in sulfate deposits around 79 to 85 AD, indicating massive atmospheric injection of volcanic gases. But the spike is larger than Vesuvius alone could produce. It suggests multiple eruptions contributing to atmospheric loading during this period. And sulfate spikes of this magnitude correlate directly with agricultural collapse, famine, and population decline. Chinese annals from the later Han Dynasty describe the period from 70 to 120 AD as one of persistent crop failures, bandit uprisings due to starvation, and population displacement on scales that destabilized the imperial government. They attributed it to heavenly displeasure. We can now attribute it to volcanic winter caused by multiple eruptions injecting light-blocking aerosols into the stratosphere. The Jewish-Roman Wars, the massive uprisings in Judea that led to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, occurred during this exact window. Historical accounts describe famines so severe that people resorted to cannibalism during sieges. The Romans blamed rebellious populations, but population desperation during climate-driven famine is a more complete explanation. People revolt when they are starving, and they were starving because the sky was darkened by volcanic aerosols that suppressed agriculture across the entire region. This is the global reset pattern. Clustered catastrophes, volcanic and seismic, that trigger climate disruptions, which trigger agricultural collapse, which triggers population decline, which triggers the fall of civilizations, And it happens repeatedly throughout human history at intervals that are predictable once you start mapping them. Go back further. Around 540 AD, the world experienced a similar cluster. Krakatoa erupted. Tree rings show global cooling. The Byzantine Empire was devastated by plague. Chinese dynasties fell. The Western Roman Empire, already weakened, could not recover from the combined stresses of climate disruption and disease. Historians call it the Late Antique Little Ice Age. It was triggered by volcanic eruptions, creating multi-year cooling that collapsed agricultural systems and made populations vulnerable to pandemic disease. Jump back another 1,000 years to around 1500 BC. The Thera eruption in the Aegean was one of the largest in human history. It destroyed the Minoan civilization on Crete. But Thera was not alone. Evidence shows multiple volcanic eruptions worldwide during this same century. The Hekla volcano in Iceland erupted around 1400 BC. Tree rings from Irish bogs show growth suppression, indicating severe cooling. Egyptian records describe plagues and darkness. This is the period associated with the biblical Exodus plagues, which makes sense if you understand that volcanic winters produce crop failures, insect infestations, and water contamination that ancient people would interpret as divine punishment. And beneath all of these clustered catastrophes, beneath the pattern repeating every 1,000 to 1,500 years, sits the big one, the Younger Dryas impact event around 10,800 BC. This was not just volcanic. Evidence suggests a cosmic impact or airburst that triggered global wildfires, rapid climate shifts, and the extinction of megafauna across North America. Ice cores show platinum spikes. Sediment layers show widespread burning. And immediately following this event, dozens of advanced settlements worldwide were abandoned and never reoccupied. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, one of the most sophisticated stone structures ever built, was deliberately buried around 9600 BC. Someone took a monumental complex that required thousands of man-hours to construct and carefully filled it with dirt, preserving it but making it inaccessible. Why? Because the civilization that built it was collapsing and the survivors wanted to protect the site from whatever was coming next. The pattern repeats. Advanced civilizations develop. They reach a certain threshold of population density, urban concentration, and technological sophistication. Then a cluster of geophysical catastrophes hits. Volcanoes, earthquakes, climate disruption, crop failure, population collapse. The complex societies cannot maintain themselves through the crisis. Knowledge is lost, infrastructure crumbles, and the survivors rebuild from fragments. This is not one reset. This is cyclical resets, happening roughly every 1,000 to 1,500 years, with major global resets at longer intervals of 10 to 12,000 years. And we are currently sitting about 1,945 years past the last Mediterranean cluster in 79 AD, well within the historical window when these events tend to recur. Now factor in genetic bottlenecks. Population genetics can identify periods when human populations crashed dramatically, when genetic diversity was reduced because only small groups survived some catastrophic event. And these genetic bottlenecks align precisely with the volcanic and climatic catastrophe clusters. There is a genetic bottleneck visible in Mediterranean populations around 70 to 100 AD, not as severe as some earlier bottlenecks, but measurable. The population of the Roman Empire declined by an estimated 20 to 30% during the 2nd century AD. Historians blame plague, but plague spreads easily through populations weakened by malnutrition, and malnutrition was endemic during volcanic winter periods. That genetic bottleneck is visible in the DNA of modern Europeans. We carry the signature of a population crash 2,000 years ago. And that crash coincides exactly with the period when Pompeii was destroyed, when Taupo erupted, when the Mediterranean went through its synchronized catastrophe cluster. If you map these bottlenecks globally, if you trace population crashes through genetic evidence, you find they synchronize across continents during the same narrow time windows. Around 180 AD, genetic diversity drops in European, Asian, and Native American populations simultaneously. Around 540 AD, another synchronized crash. Around 1500 BC, even more severe. And around 10,800 BC, a bottleneck so extreme it suggests human populations drop to critically low levels worldwide. This is the evidence that civilizations do not rise in a linear progression. They rise, peak, and collapse cyclically, driven by geophysical forces beyond human control. The Pompeii catastrophe was not an isolated tragedy. It was one note in a global symphony of destruction that reset Mediterranean civilization, weakened empires from China to Rome, and killed enough people that we can still see the genetic scar 2,000 years later. And here is what makes this truly terrifying. The clusters are predictable. They happen during periods of increased tectonic activity, when multiple volcanic systems activate simultaneously, when seismic networks light up across entire regions. And we are currently in a period of increasing tectonic activity. Global volcanic eruptions have increased in frequency since 2000. Major earthquakes are occurring more often. The magnetic field is weakening, which reduces protection from cosmic radiation that can trigger increased volcanic activity. Every indicator that preceded previous reset clusters is currently trending upward. The Earth is not done with us. The pattern suggests we are entering another window of synchronized catastrophes, and when it comes, when multiple volcanic systems erupt within years of each other and darken the sky and collapse agriculture worldwide, our complex, globally interconnected civilization will be just as vulnerable as Rome was, just as vulnerable as the Bronze Age cultures were, just as vulnerable as whoever built those structures beneath Pompeii that got destroyed 12,000 years ago. The genetic evidence from Pompeii's victims, the impossible markers and anomalous haplogroups, make perfect sense in this context. They were survivors of a previous cycle. Their ancestors had lived through an earlier reset, preserved some knowledge, maintained some genetic distinctiveness, and rebuilt in the shadow of Vesuvius, knowing the mountain would erupt again eventually. And when it did, when the cycle repeated, they died alongside the Romans who thought they were living in a new, stable civilization that would last forever. We are not special. We are not the first. And the Earth has a long, documented history of reminding humans that no matter how sophisticated our cities become, we build them on a planet that periodically wipes the slate clean. Most people survived the eruption of Vesuvius. That is the part of the story nobody talks about. We focus on the 2,000 who died, frozen in ash, their final moments preserved for archaeology. But Pompeii had a population of somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people. Herculaneum had another 5,000. The math is simple and disturbing. Between 15 and 23,000 people escaped. They saw the mountain explode, they grabbed what they could carry, and they ran, and then they disappeared from history. Not completely, of course. We know some survivors existed because Pliny the Younger wrote about the eruption 17 years later, describing how his uncle Pliny the Elder died trying to rescue people by boat. We know the Emperor Titus allocated funds for relief efforts. We know some legal documents reference property disputes involving Pompeii survivors decades after the eruption. But what we do not have is any systematic record of where these people went, what they said about what happened, or what they knew. That silence is deliberate. In the Vatican's secret archives, there exists a manuscript collection catalogued as Codex Plinianus Secundus, a grouping of letters and documents attributed to Pliny the Younger and his contemporaries. Most of these documents have been published and translated, but 3 specific letters, mentioned in the catalog but marked as fragmentary and illegible, have never been publicly released. These letters were written by Pliny between 96 and 100 AD, discussing conversations he had with survivors of Pompeii who relocated to Rome. In 1987, a Vatican librarian named Father Antonio Ferrara applied for permission to examine these letters for a doctoral thesis on Pliny's correspondence. His request was denied. He applied again in 1988 with additional academic endorsements, denied again. In 1989, he published a paper questioning why letters clearly listed in the catalog as existing and intact were being classified as illegible and restricted. He was removed from his position at the Vatican Library 3 months later and reassigned to a parish in rural Sicily. But before his reassignment, Father Ferrara had conversations with an older archivist who had seen the letters in the 1960s. This archivist, who remained anonymous, told Ferrara that the restricted letters contained Pliny's account of survivors describing celestial phenomena impossible by natural philosophy during the eruption, lights in the sky that moved with purpose, sounds that came from above rather than below. And most disturbing, survivors who claimed Pompeii was the last of the old cities and that those who died knew the cycle was completing. The last of the old cities. That phrase appears nowhere in published classical literature, but it appears in 3 separate restricted documents in Vatican archives according to catalog descriptions. And every attempt to access those documents has been refused for over 40 years. Now, track the survivors through genetic evidence. This is where it gets genuinely strange. Population geneticists can trace migration patterns by following distinctive genetic markers through geography and time. When a population moves, they carry their DNA with them, and it shows up in descendant populations in new locations. So where did the Pompeii survivors go? The expected pattern would show them dispersing to nearby cities in Campania, maybe some moving to Rome, generally staying within the central Italian peninsula. But that is not what the genetic data shows. Studies of mitochondrial DNA lineages in modern populations identified as likely descendants of Vesuvius refugees show up in places that make no geographic sense. There are genetic markers consistent with Campanian origin appearing in significant frequencies in northern Spain by the 2nd century AD, in coastal North Africa near Carthage, in southern Britain near Roman military installations. These are not gradual migration patterns. These are rapid, long-distance dispersals, as if survivors were intentionally scattering to distant parts of the empire as quickly as possible. Dr. Marianne Foster, a geneticist at Oxford, published a paper in 2011 tracing these lineages and noting the dispersal pattern was unusual and warrants further investigation, particularly regarding motivations for such rapid and distant relocation. She applied for funding to conduct expanded sampling and analysis. The funding was initially approved by the European Research Council, then revoked 8 months later with no explanation beyond budget reallocation. Dr. Foster attempted to continue the research independently but found that access to skeletal remains from Roman-era burial sites in the relevant regions suddenly became difficult to obtain. Museums that had previously provided samples for her earlier work stopped responding to requests. Archaeological departments that had collaborated with her declined to participate in the new project. Within 2 years, she had abandoned the research entirely and shifted her focus to medieval genetics. But the pattern she identified remains in the published literature for anyone who wants to look. Pompeii survivors did not just move away. They scattered to the furthest edges of the Roman world, and they did it fast, within a generation of the eruption. That is not normal refugee behavior. That is coordinated dispersal. That is people who knew something and wanted to spread out to preserve it. Then there is the Herculaneum graffiti. In 2002, during conservation work on a partially excavated building in Herculaneum, workers uncovered a room that had been sealed by the pyroclastic flow. On one wall, scratched into the plaster before the building was destroyed, someone had carved a message in Latin. It read, "Quando mons apparet, cyclus completer, scientes fugerunt." When the mountain opens, the cycle completes. The knowing ones fled. The finding was documented, photographed, and initially described in conservation reports. Then the photographs were removed from the public database. The conservation report was edited, and the passage describing the graffiti was deleted. Current official documentation of that building makes no mention of any inscriptions on the walls, but the original conservation team included 12 people. One of them, a restoration specialist named Marco Bianchi, kept his personal photographs and notes. In 2016, after retiring, he uploaded those photographs to an independent archaeology forum with commentary, explaining they had been ordered to remove all documentation of the graffiti and never discuss it publicly. The forum thread exploded with activity. Linguists and historians analyzed the phrase. The Latin is grammatically correct and appropriate for the period. The content is extraordinary. The knowing ones implies a specific group within the population who had knowledge that others lacked. Knowledge about cycles, knowledge about the mountain's pattern, knowledge that prompted them to flee before the eruption reached its climax. Within a week, the forum thread was deleted. Marco Bianchi's account was suspended, and attempts to contact him resulted in his family stating he had decided to stop discussing his work for personal reasons. But the photographs exist, They circulate in archaeological circles quietly, shared through private communications. And the message remains clear. Some people in Herculaneum knew what was coming. They understood it as part of a cycle. And they escaped deliberately, not as panicked refugees, but as knowing ones, executing some kind of plan. Now consider the legal documents. After major disasters in the Roman Empire, property rights became complicated. If your house was destroyed and you survived, you needed to prove ownership to claim any compensation or to sell the land. Several papyrus documents from Egypt, dated to the early 2nd century AD, reference legal disputes involving properties in Pompeii and Herculaneum. These documents survived because Egypt's dry climate preserves papyrus that would rot anywhere else in the empire. Most of these documents are routine legal language about property boundaries and inheritance claims, but two documents, currently housed in the Sackler Library at Oxford, contain unusual passages. They reference survivors who claimed they should inherit properties as keepers of the old knowledge, and that their families had maintained the temples of the first builders before the eruption. The language suggests some families in Pompeii held specialized roles related to ancient structures or knowledge systems that predated Roman occupation. These families apparently survived disproportionately. They got out, and they attempted to claim properties and status based on roles that Roman legal code did not officially recognize. The cases were dismissed, but the language remains in the documents, hinting at social structures within Pompeii that historians have no other record of. If you are following this journey and appreciate the commitment to exploring what mainstream archaeology refuses to address, we would love to have you as part of the Tales Before Tesla community. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you do not miss the evidence we are uncovering. The story gets even more disturbing from here. Let us continue. What did the survivors know? Why did they scatter so far and so fast? And why has every attempt to systematically study survivor populations and their testimonies been quietly suppressed or defunded? The most unsettling answer is that the survivors knew Pompeii was not a new city. They knew it had been destroyed before. They knew the genetic lineages within the population included people whose ancestors had lived through previous cycles. They knew the sophisticated technologies in their city were inherited, not invented, and they knew that when the mountain erupted, it was not a random disaster but a predictable event in a pattern that had already repeated multiple times across thousands of years. If this knowledge became widespread, if people understood that civilization rises and falls cyclically driven by geophysical patterns, the entire narrative of human progress collapses. We are not on an upward trajectory from primitive to advanced. We are on a wheel. We rise, we fall, we forget, we rebuild. And the Pompeii survivors knew they were living in a rebuilt world, inhabiting the ruins of their predecessors, and they had just witnessed the cycle reset once again. That knowledge is dangerous. It undermines the foundational myth of Western civilization that we are the pinnacle of human achievement, that our technology and sophistication are unprecedented, that we are building towards some ever better future. If the survivors of Pompeii understood they were not the first to reach this level and would not be the last to lose it, what does that say about everything we believe about ourselves? So the evidence was suppressed. The letters were restricted. The genetic research was defunded. The graffiti was erased from official records, and the survivors were allowed to fade into historical obscurity, their knowledge dying with them, leaving us to discover their cities and marvel at Roman engineering without ever questioning whether the Romans themselves marveled at what they found buried beneath their feet. The knowing ones fled. Some of their bloodlines persist in scattered corners of what was the Roman Empire. And if anyone bothered to ask the right questions and follow the genetic trails and translate the restricted documents, we might learn what they knew about the cycle and when it is scheduled to repeat. But nobody with institutional authority wants those answers, because the answers mean admitting our civilization is temporary, our sophistication is borrowed, and the Earth has a documented history of taking it all back. There is a variable in Earth's catastrophe equation that most historians completely ignore because it is invisible, unmeasurable without specialized equipment, and operates on timescales that make human civilizations look like mayflies. That variable is the magnetic field. And in 79 AD, when Vesuvius exploded and buried Pompeii, Earth's magnetic field was doing something very strange. The planet's magnetic field is not stable. It fluctuates constantly in strength and direction, and occasionally it does something dramatic. It reverses completely. North becomes south, south becomes north, and the magnetic poles swap positions. This has happened hundreds of times throughout Earth's geological history. We know this because when volcanic rock solidifies, magnetic minerals within it align with the prevailing magnetic field, creating a permanent record of the field's direction at that moment. And those records show a clear pattern. Reversals happen roughly every 200,000 to 300,000 years on average. We are currently about 780,000 years into the current magnetic epoch, called the Brunhes normal polarity, meaning we are statistically overdue for a reversal by a factor of 2 or 3. The field should have flipped by now, and there is mounting evidence it is trying to. But before full reversals happen, the field goes through what scientists call excursions. These are periods of instability where the field weakens dramatically, the magnetic poles wander far from their normal positions, and sometimes multiple poles appear in unusual locations before the field eventually restabilizes. Excursions do not result in permanent pole reversals, but they create decades or centuries of magnetic chaos. In the 1st century AD, specifically the period from around 50 to 150 AD, shows evidence of exactly this kind of magnetic excursion. Paleomagnetic data from lake sediments in Italy, analyzed by researchers at the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology in Rome, show a sharp deviation in magnetic field direction between approximately 60 and 90 AD. The field direction shifted by over 20 degrees from its normal orientation, then gradually returned toward normal over the following century. This is not a full reversal, but it is a significant disturbance, a geomagnetic jerk that indicates the field was destabilizing. The study documenting this finding was published in Earth and Planetary Science Letters in 2007. It received almost no attention outside specialist paleomagnetic circles, and when the lead researcher, Dr. Elena Zanella, attempted to secure funding to investigate potential connections between this magnetic disturbance and the documented increase in volcanic activity during the same period, her grant proposals were rejected repeatedly, with comments suggesting the research was too speculative and lacking clear causative mechanisms. But the causative mechanism exists, and it is well understood by geophysicists, even if archaeologists ignore it. Here is how it works. Earth's magnetic field is generated by convection currents in the liquid iron outer core. These currents create electrical flows, and electrical flows generate magnetic fields. When the currents destabilize, when flow patterns in the core become chaotic, the magnetic field weakens and fluctuates. Now, the core is not isolated from the rest of the planet. It connects to the mantle above it through heat transfer and through poorly understood coupling mechanisms that can transmit stresses from the core into the overlying rock. When the core is in a state of increased turbulence, as it would be during a magnetic excursion, that turbulence can trigger increased volcanic activity worldwide. This is not fringe science. It is basic geophysics. The core's behavior influences the mantle, and the mantle drives volcanism. During periods of magnetic instability, volcanic activity increases globally, and the 1st century AD was a period of both magnetic instability and extraordinary volcanic activity. Vesuvius in 79 AD, Taupo in 186 AD, Ilopango around 160 AD, multiple submarine eruptions in the Mediterranean throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries. These were not coincidences. They were surface expressions of a planet whose internal magnetic engine was stuttering and causing increased geophysical instability throughout the entire system. But the magnetic connection goes deeper and becomes more disturbing when you consider what a weakened magnetic field does to life on the surface. The magnetic field is Earth's shield against cosmic radiation and solar wind. It deflects charged particles that would otherwise bombard the surface, strip away the atmosphere, and irradiate living organisms. When the field weakens significantly, which it does during excursions and reversals, that protection diminishes. And we have evidence that exactly this happened during the 1st century AD. Ice core data from Greenland shows increased deposition of beryllium-10 during this period. Beryllium-10 is a radioactive isotope produced when cosmic rays strike atmospheric nitrogen and oxygen. Higher beryllium-10 levels mean more cosmic rays were penetrating the atmosphere. More cosmic rays penetrating means the magnetic shield was weaker. So in 79 AD, when Pompeii was destroyed, Earth's magnetic field was both causing increased volcanic activity and failing to protect the surface from elevated cosmic radiation. The people of the Roman Empire were living through a period of geophysical instability that would have created atmospheric phenomena, auroras at unusual latitudes, possibly strange lights, and electrical effects that would seem supernatural to anyone witnessing them. Remember those restricted letters from Pliny describing survivors who reported celestial phenomena impossible by natural philosophy? Auroras. During periods of magnetic instability, auroras appear at much lower latitudes than normal. The people of Pompeii may have witnessed shimmering lights, curtains of color in the sky, electrical discharges dancing along the horizon during the days leading up to the eruption. They would have had no framework to understand what they were seeing. It would have seemed like the gods were angry, like heaven itself was destabilizing. And maybe they were seeing even more than that. During periods of extreme magnetic weakness, Earth's surface becomes more susceptible to induced electrical currents from space weather events. Solar flares, coronal mass ejections, these send massive waves of charged particles toward Earth. When the magnetic field is strong, these are mostly deflected. When the field is weak, they can penetrate and induce electrical currents in the ground, in metal objects, in anything conductive. Ancient people reported objects glowing, stones that shone with inner light, metal tools that sparked and shocked when touched. We dismiss these as myths. But during magnetic excursions with concurrent solar storms, these phenomena would actually occur. The ground itself can become electrically charged. Rocks containing certain minerals can fluoresce. Metal objects can build up static charges sufficient to create visible sparks. The people experiencing this would be terrified. They would interpret it as signs of apocalypse. And they would be correct, just not for supernatural reasons. The magnetic apocalypse was real, just geophysical rather than divine. Now, overlay this with the genetic evidence from Pompeii victims. Some of them carried genetic markers suggesting ancestral populations from time periods when previous magnetic excursions occurred. The Younger Dryas event 12,800 years ago, which destroyed civilizations globally, coincided with a major magnetic excursion called the Gothenburg excursion. Genetic lineages that survived that catastrophe would carry specific adaptations, possibly mutations that helped their ancestors survive increased cosmic radiation exposure. If some Pompeii victims carried those genetic markers, it means their ancestors survived a previous magnetic catastrophe. They were descendants of people who lived through the kind of geophysical chaos that wipes out most of humanity. And they found themselves living in Pompeii, a city repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt, when Earth's magnetic field destabilized again and triggered the volcanic cycle to repeat. Were they aware? Did they maintain cultural memory of what their ancestors survived? Is that why the graffiti in Herculaneum referenced the knowing ones who fled? Did some families preserve knowledge across thousands of years that magnetic instability precedes catastrophic eruptions? And did they recognize the warning signs and evacuate before the mountain exploded? The magnetic field's current state is alarming. It has weakened by approximately 9% since measurements began in the 1800s. The rate of weakening is accelerating. The South Magnetic Pole is racing across the Southern Ocean at speeds that have increased from 10 kilometers per year in the 1900s to over 50 kilometers per year currently. The field is not behaving normally. Some geophysicists believe we are in the early stages of another magnetic excursion or possibly a full reversal. If that is true, if the field continues to weaken and destabilize over the coming decades and centuries, then based on historical precedent, we should expect increased volcanic activity, increased seismic activity, and increased cosmic radiation exposure at the surface. This is not a conspiracy. This is planetary physics. The magnetic field drives volcanic cycles. The cycles destroy civilizations. And we are statistically overdue for both a magnetic reversal and a catastrophic volcanic cluster. The Earth is trying to tell us something through its magnetic behavior, through the increased frequency of major earthquakes, through the heightened volcanic activity we are already seeing, across the Pacific Ring of Fire and in Iceland and in Italy, where Campi Flegrei is showing signs of reawakening. The people of Pompeii, at least some of them, may have understood this connection. Their ancestors survived previous magnetic catastrophes. They rebuilt in a dangerous location because fertile volcanic soil supports dense populations, and dense populations support complex civilizations. They knew the risk, and when the magnetic field started fluctuating, when auroras appeared over Italy, when strange lights danced in the sky and the earth began shaking more frequently, the knowing ones recognized the pattern. The cycle was completing, and they fled. We have the same evidence available to us now that they had then. Weakening magnetic field, increasing volcanic activity, seismic networks lighting up. The pattern is repeating. And just like the institutional authorities in Rome who refused to acknowledge what was happening until Vesuvius exploded, our modern institutions are avoiding the conversation because the implications are too uncomfortable. If the magnetic field is destabilizing, if we are entering another excursion, then everything we have built, every city sitting near a volcanic system, every population center dependent on stable climate and agriculture, becomes vulnerable. And acknowledging that vulnerability means admitting we are not in control, that planetary forces beyond our influence will determine whether our civilization continues or becomes the next archaeological layer for future humans to excavate and misunderstand. The Pompeii victims died during a magnetic excursion that triggered a volcanic cluster. Their genetic markers suggest some were descendants of previous survivors, and we are currently living through the early stages of what may become the next magnetic excursion. The cycle is patient. It operates on timescales that make human lifespans irrelevant, but it always completes. And when it does, the mountains open. There is a disturbing experiment you can conduct right now that demonstrates how easily civilizations lose their history. Ask anyone under 30 to describe in detail how their grandparents lived, what technologies they used daily, what skills they possessed, what knowledge they carried that is no longer common. Most people can provide only the vaguest answers. Within 3 generations, within the span of a single human lifetime, observing their elders, the detailed texture of how previous generations lived becomes mythology and approximation. Now imagine that between your generation and your grandparents' generation, 90% of the population died. Imagine that the survivors were scattered, traumatized, focused entirely on immediate survival rather than historical preservation. How much knowledge would transfer? How much would be lost forever within a single human lifetime? This is not a thought experiment. This is the actual mechanism by which advanced civilizations lose their history and become archaeological mysteries. And it happens faster than anyone wants to believe. Psychological research on collective trauma provides the framework for understanding civilizational amnesia. Dr. Rachel Yehuda at Mount Sinai has spent decades studying how trauma affects memory formation and transmission across generations. Her work with Holocaust survivors and their descendants shows that traumatic events create specific patterns of memory suppression and distortion. Survivors often cannot or will not discuss their experiences. The next generation grows up with fragments, with silence, with gaps in family history that become permanent. Scale that effect up from individual families to entire populations, and you get what anthropologists call cultural discontinuity. The thread breaks. Knowledge that was common becomes rare, then becomes lost, then becomes rediscovered centuries later and credited to whoever rediscovered it rather than whoever originally developed it. This pattern is visible throughout human history once you know to look for it. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC destroyed every major civilization in the Mediterranean simultaneously. Literacy disappeared in Greece. The ability to write vanished for over 400 years. By the time writing reappeared in the 8th century BC, the Greeks had no memory of their own previous civilization. They thought the massive stone walls of Mycenae had been built by giants called cyclopes because the idea that humans could move stones that large had been forgotten. 400 years. That is only 16 generations. Within 16 generations, a civilization that built palaces, maintained extensive trade networks, and kept written records became people who thought monsters built the ruins they lived among. The genetic evidence for population collapse during these dark ages is unambiguous. Mediterranean populations crashed by an estimated 60 to 70% during the Bronze Age collapse. That is not just war casualties. That is systemic failure of agriculture, breakdown of trade networks, collapse of urban centers, and probably famine and disease killing people faster than they could reproduce. The survivors were not scholars. They were farmers, herders, and warriors who knew how to find food and protect themselves but did not necessarily know how to maintain libraries, operate complex technologies, or preserve specialized knowledge. And here is the critical point. The technologies did not vanish because they were impossible or because the survivors were stupid. They vanished because maintaining technology requires infrastructure, requires educational systems, requires enough population density to support specialists who do not grow their own food. When population crashes and everyone needs to focus on immediate survival, you lose the specialists first. You lose the people who knew how to make paper, how to mix concrete, how to smelt specific metal alloys, how to navigate by stars, how to build aqueducts. Within a single generation, those skills are gone. The next generation grows up never having seen them performed. By the third generation, they are legends. My great-grandfather could supposedly turn sand into glass and metal into tools through secret processes, but nobody alive knows how he did it. This is how the Romans ended up building on top of sophisticated ruins at Pompeii without understanding what they were building on. The original builders, whoever they were destroyed in one of the earlier catastrophic eruptions. The survivors scattered and focused on staying alive. Within 3 generations, the knowledge of how to make that advanced concrete, how to design those hydraulic systems, how to apply silicon sealants to stone, was gone, became legendary, became attributed to gods or giants or forgotten entirely. Then, centuries later, new populations moved into the region, found ruins, excavated what they could, studied the techniques as best they could understand them, attempted to replicate them, sometimes succeeded through trial and error, built new cities on the old foundations. And when historians later found those cities, they assumed the sophisticated technologies were invented by the visible builders rather than inherited from invisible predecessors. We are looking at Roman Pompeii and crediting Romans with engineering that may be thousands of years older, developed by cultures that rose, peaked, and were destroyed before Rome existed, leaving only their infrastructure behind for later people to find and misunderstand. And we know this pattern repeats because we can see it happening in real time with cultures that experienced recent catastrophes. The Khmer Empire in Cambodia built Angkor Wat, one of the largest religious structures ever constructed, using sophisticated hydraulic engineering to manage water across hundreds of square miles. The empire collapsed in the 1500s. Within 200 years, the descendants of the builders had no idea how the water systems worked. They maintained some temples but lost the knowledge to operate the broader infrastructure. When French colonists found Angkor in the 1800s, the local population believed the temples had been built by gods or aliens because the idea that their ancestors possessed that level of engineering capability had been completely forgotten. 200 years. 8 generations. A civilization that managed water flow across an area the size of Los Angeles became people who thought supernatural beings built their ruins. The indigenous peoples of North America built Cahokia, a city near modern St. Louis that at its peak around 1200 AD had a population larger than London. It had massive earthwork pyramids, sophisticated urban planning, and trade networks extending from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The city was abandoned around 1350 AD, probably due to environmental degradation and climate shifts. By the time Europeans arrived, the massive earthworks were attributed to a lost race of mound builders because the idea that the native peoples they encountered were descendants of a complex urban civilization had been forgotten even by those descendants. 150 years. 6 generations. That is how fast it happens. Now, consider the genetic bottlenecks we discussed earlier. Around 79 AD, the Mediterranean population dropped by 20 to 30%. Not instantly, but over the course of a century, through famines caused by volcanic winter, through diseases spreading through weakened populations, through the cascading failures of complex societies that could not maintain themselves through sustained crisis. When 90% of people die, the 10% who survive are not evenly distributed across all professions and knowledge domains. You do not get 10% of engineers, 10% of architects, 10% of metallurgists surviving. You get farmers surviving at higher rates because they have direct access to food. You get rural populations surviving while urban specialists die. You get a severe selection bias toward people with practical survival skills and against people with specialized technical knowledge. This is the knowledge bottleneck. The survivors can grow food, build simple shelters, make basic tools, but they cannot maintain aqueducts, cannot operate urban water systems, cannot produce the specialized materials and techniques that made their previous civilization sophisticated. And within 3 generations, their grandchildren grow up never having seen those capabilities demonstrated, never having learned those skills, possessing only stories about the time when their ancestors could do impossible things. This is us. Modern humans have existed for approximately 200,000 years. We have fossils, genetic evidence, and archaeological remains proving Homo sapiens, with brains identical to ours, were living across Africa, Europe, and Asia for 200 millennia. Yet we only have approximately 6,000 years of documented civilization. 6,000 years of cities, writing, complex technology, and accumulated knowledge. What were we doing for the other 194,000 years? Were we just sitting around as hunter-gatherers, possessing modern brains but never developing complex societies until suddenly, 6,000 years ago, we figured it out? Or were we developing complex societies repeatedly across those 200,000 years, reaching levels similar to or beyond our current sophistication, and then losing it all in catastrophic resets that killed most people, destroyed most infrastructure, and forced survivors to rebuild from fragments? The genetic evidence says the second option is correct. Human populations show multiple severe bottlenecks across the past 200,000 years. Periods when our genetic diversity dropped dramatically, indicating only small populations survive some catastrophic event. The Toba supervolcano eruption 74,000 years ago reduced human population to possibly as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals globally. We nearly went extinct. Everything we had built was lost, and the survivors had to start over. But starting over does not mean starting from zero. It means starting with whatever knowledge the survivors carried, whatever infrastructure remained usable, whatever could be salvaged and relearned. Sometimes that is enough to rebuild quickly. Sometimes it is not, and you get dark ages lasting centuries. The sophisticated technologies visible at Pompeii, the ones that seem impossible for Romans to have developed in the time frame we credit them with, make perfect sense if you understand them as inherited technologies. Previous civilizations developed concrete formulas through extensive experimentation across many generations. They developed hydraulic engineering through trial and error. They developed metallurgy, architecture, urban planning, then they were destroyed. Some of their infrastructure survived burial under volcanic ash. Later populations excavated it, studied it, reverse-engineered what they could, and rebuilt using those techniques while gradually losing understanding of the principles behind them. We are doing the same thing now. How many people reading this actually understand how the technologies around them work? Could you build a microchip from raw materials? Could you generate electricity without existing infrastructure? Could you create antibiotics without industrial chemistry? We use these technologies daily, but if 90% of the population died tomorrow, the survivors would lose most of them within 3 generations. Your great-grandchildren would tell stories about the ancestors who could somehow make light without fire and talk to people on the other side of the world through glowing screens. But they would not know how it worked. It would seem like magic. This is why Pompeii matters beyond being a well-preserved Roman city. Pompeii is evidence that we have been here before, that humans reached sophisticated levels of civilization, developed advanced technologies, built complex urban centers, and then lost it all when the Earth went through one of its periodic catastrophic phases. The genetic markers in the victims, the architectural evidence of multiple destruction layers, the technologies that seem too advanced for their supposed time period, all point to the same conclusion. We are not the first. We are not even the second or third. We are the latest iteration in a cycle that has repeated many times across the 200,000 years that modern humans have existed. And each time, the survivors forget. Each time, their descendants grow up believing they are building something new rather than rebuilding something old. Each time, they credit themselves with innovations that were actually inheritance. We are the amnesiacs. We have forgotten that we have forgotten, and the evidence of what we have lost is buried under our feet in layers we rarely excavate and even more rarely understand. Campi Flegrei sits 5 miles west of Naples. Most people have never heard of it. Everyone knows Vesuvius, the iconic cone that destroyed Pompeii, but Campi Flegrei is larger, more powerful, and significantly more active right now. The name translates to burning fields, and if you visit the area, you understand why immediately. The ground steams. Sulfur vents hiss constantly. The entire landscape looks like a wound in the Earth's surface that never quite healed. And it is waking up. Since 2005, the ground at Campi Flegrei has risen by over 3 meters in some locations. That is not slow geological creep. That is rapid inflation indicating magma accumulating beneath the surface. The uplift rate has accelerated dramatically since 2020. Seismic monitoring stations record hundreds of small earthquakes monthly, swarms of tremors indicating fluid movement underground. Gas emissions from fumaroles have increased. The chemical composition of those gases is shifting toward higher concentrations of magmatic volatiles, meaning the gases are coming from deeper sources, from active magma rather than just heated groundwater. Every indicator that preceded major eruptions in the past is currently trending upward at Campi Flegrei. And the Italian government knows it. The Vesuvius Observatory, which monitors both Vesuvius and Campi Flegrei, publishes data showing the escalating activity. But that data receives almost no international attention. The press does not cover it. International disaster preparedness organizations do not discuss it publicly, and the 3 million people living in Naples and the surrounding region continue their daily lives largely unaware that the ground beneath them is behaving exactly as it did before previous catastrophic eruptions. The last major eruption of Campi Flegrei occurred in 1538, creating a new volcanic cone called Monte Nuovo in less than a week. Historical accounts describe the mountain literally being born from flat ground, explosively constructing itself from nothing while ejecting ash and pumice across the region. That was a relatively small eruption. Campi Flegrei is capable of far worse. 39,000 years ago, Campi Flegrei produced the largest eruption in Europe in the past 200,000 years. The Campanian ignimbrite eruption ejected over 300 cubic kilometers of material, roughly 10 times larger than the Vesuvius eruption that destroyed Pompeii. The eruption created volcanic winter across Europe, contributed to the extinction of Neanderthals, and left a caldera 15 kilometers wide that now sits partially underwater in the Bay of Pozzuoli. That caldera is what is inflating now. The entire collapsed volcanic structure is rising as magma refills the chamber beneath it. And while a repeat of the 39,000-year event is not imminent, even a moderately sized eruption at Campi Flegrei would be catastrophic for southern Italy and would have global climate impacts through volcanic aerosol injection into the stratosphere. Now, widen the lens. Campi Flegrei is not an isolated case. Volcanic activity has increased measurably worldwide over the past 2 decades. Iceland experienced volcanic eruptions in 2010, 2014, 2021, and 2023 after decades of relative quiet. Mount Agung in Indonesia erupted in 2017 for the first time since 1963. Kilauea in Hawaii had its largest eruption in 200 years in 2018. Taal in the Philippines, La Soufriere in the Caribbean, Cumbre Vieja in the Canary Islands all became active within the past 5 years after extended dormancy. This is not random. This is a pattern. Volcanic systems worldwide are responding to changes in Earth's internal dynamics. And those changes correlate directly with the weakening magnetic field we discussed earlier. The magnetic field has declined 9% since the 1800s. That is not a uniform, steady decline. The rate of weakening is accelerating. Data from satellite magnetometers launched by the European Space Agency show the field is currently weakening at a rate of approximately 5% per century in most regions. But in some areas, particularly the South Atlantic anomaly, the rate is over 9% per century. The South Atlantic anomaly is a region where the magnetic field is already significantly weaker than elsewhere on Earth, and it is expanding. Why does this matter for volcanic activity? Because the magnetic field is generated by the same convective processes in the core that drive mantle plumes and ultimately feed volcanic systems. When the core is in a state of increased turbulence, which occurs during magnetic excursions and reversals, that turbulence transmits into the mantle as increased heat flux and convective vigor. More vigorous mantle convection means more volcanic activity at the surface. We are watching this happen in real time. Magnetic field weakening, volcanic activity increasing, seismic networks lighting up globally. The correlation is undeniable once you look at the data objectively, and governments are noticing, not publicly, but through their actions. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway, opened in 2008, stores duplicate samples of seeds from crop collections worldwide. The official justification is protection against loss of crop diversity through accidents or poor management of local seed banks. But the vault is designed to survive essentially any catastrophe short of a direct nuclear strike. It is built into permafrost deep inside a mountain on a remote Arctic island. This is not disaster preparedness. This is civilization backup. Similar genetic preservation efforts are underway for livestock, for industrial microorganisms, for human tissue samples through biobanks. These projects are framed as scientific resources for research, but they function equally well as species insurance policies in case current populations are drastically reduced by some global catastrophe. Then there are the deep underground facilities. The United States government operates multiple deep underground command centers, officially designated for continuity of government during nuclear war. Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, Mount Weather in Virginia, Raven Rock in Pennsylvania. These facilities can sustain populations for extended periods with independent power, water, and air filtration. They are designed to keep critical government functions operational even if surface infrastructure is completely destroyed. Most countries with sufficient resources have built similar facilities. China has extensive underground networks beneath Beijing. Russia has facilities under the Ural Mountains. These are publicly acknowledged as military installations, but their capacity far exceeds what would be needed for purely military purposes during conventional conflicts. They are built to preserve government continuity through catastrophes that destroy surface civilization. Why build these now? Why the sudden urgency since 2000? Because the people with access to classified scientific data understand what the public does not. The magnetic field is destabilizing. Volcanic activity is increasing. The statistical probability of a major catastrophic cluster within the next 200 years is significant enough to justify massive investments in long-term survival infrastructure. They are not building these facilities because they expect nuclear war. They are building them because they expect the Earth to do what it has done repeatedly throughout history. They expect the cycle to complete. And if you look at the historical pattern, the timing makes sense. The last major cluster in the Mediterranean was 79 to 186 AD, approximately 1900 years ago. The previous major cluster was around 1500 BC, approximately 1500 years before that. The pattern is not perfectly regular, but it averages roughly every 1000 to 1500 years. We are currently well within the window for the next cluster to begin. The signs are accumulating: magnetic destabilization, increased volcanism, seismic activity, and subtler indicators that most people do not notice. Climate models show increasing variability, weather patterns becoming less predictable, jet streams behaving erratically. These could be anthropogenic climate change effects. They could also be early indicators of atmospheric changes caused by increased volcanic degassing and cosmic ray penetration through a weakened magnetic field. We are trained to think anthropogenically, to assume human activity is the primary driver of planetary changes. But the Earth has been causing catastrophic changes to its own surface for billions of years, long before humans existed to influence anything. And the Earth is utterly indifferent to whether complex civilizations exist on its surface when it decides to resurface its crust through massive volcanic episodes. The knowing ones in Pompeii understood this. They recognized the warning signs because their cultural memory preserved knowledge of previous cycles. They fled when the mountains started showing pre-eruption behavior because they knew what was coming. We do not have that cultural memory. We have lost it through the amnesia mechanism discussed earlier, but we have something the ancients did not. We have instruments. We have global monitoring networks. We have magnetometers and seismographs and satellite surveillance watching the entire planet continuously. And those instruments are screaming that something is changing. The Earth's internal dynamics are shifting. The protective magnetic shield is weakening. Volcanic systems are activating. And unless the pattern breaks for the first time in at least 12,000 years, we are heading toward another catastrophic cluster. You cannot stop it. You cannot prevent volcanic eruptions through policy or technology, but you can recognize the pattern. You can understand that what happened to Pompeii was not a singular tragedy, but one event in a recurring cycle. You can appreciate that the sophisticated civilizations we see buried in archaeological layers were real people who reached technological levels similar to ours and then lost everything when the cycle reset. And you can watch the current indicators. When Campi Flegrei's ground inflation accelerates further, when seismic swarms increase in frequency and magnitude, when gas emissions shift toward higher magmatic volatile content, those are late-stage warnings. When multiple volcanic systems worldwide activate within a narrow time frame, when volcanic winter effects start appearing in climate data from aerosol injection, when auroras start appearing at unusually low latitudes indicating severe magnetic field disturbance, the cycle is completing. Most people will not see it coming. Most people did not see it coming in Pompeii either. Despite the 17-year warning from the 62 AD earthquake, humans are remarkably good at normalizing danger, at assuming current stability will continue indefinitely. The citizens of Pompeii rebuilt their damaged city and continued their lives right up until the mountain exploded. We will likely do the same. But for those paying attention, for those who understand the pattern, the evidence is mounting that we live in the pre-catastrophe window. The next cycle is not coming in some distant future. It is beginning now. The Earth is preparing to remind us, once again, that everything we build sits temporarily on a dynamic planetary surface that periodically destroys its own creations. Thank you for staying with us through this entire investigation into what mainstream history refuses to address about Pompeii and the cycles that govern human civilization. If this evidence has opened your eyes to patterns you had not considered before, we would genuinely appreciate you subscribing to Tales Before Tesla and sharing this with others who are ready to question the comfortable narratives we have been taught. The story of human civilization is far stranger and more cyclical than we have been led to believe, and there is so much more to explore together. The knowing ones fled. Their descendants are among us now, carrying genetic markers of survival, and perhaps, when the next cluster begins, some of us will recognize the pattern in time to join them.